There is a moment, and if you have lived it, you know exactly what I'm talking about, where something shifts. Not loudly, not with the dramatic collapse you might have expected after everything you endured. It shifts quietly, like a door closing at the end of a long hallway. You finally leave. You finally choose yourself. And the world, for the first time in what feels like years, begins to feel like yours again. But something else is happening in that same moment. Something on the other side of that closed door. Something the narcissist will never fully explain, never fully admit, and in many cases, never fully understand about themselves. Because what happens when a narcissist loses an empath is not simply the end of a relationship. It is not just a loss of a partner or a source of comfort, or even what psychologists call narcissistic supply. What happens is something far more profound, far more irreversible, and far more spiritually significant than any of those clinical terms can capture. What happens is that the narcissist loses the only real connection they ever had to something greater than themselves. Let that sit for a moment, because to understand it fully, we have to go back to the beginning. We have to understand something about the narcissist that most people never see, not because it excuses them, but because it explains the invisible architecture of everything that happened between you. The narcissist, by the very nature of who they are and how their inner world is constructed, is spiritually sealed off. Their entire psychological existence is organized around one singular, relentless mission: protect the ego at all costs, maintain the image, defend against vulnerability, never, under any circumstances, allow anything that could unmake the carefully constructed version of themselves they present to the world. And here is the problem with that mission, a problem that runs deeper than psychology, deeper than behavior patterns, deeper than the cycles of idealization and devaluation that you live through. The problem is that genuine spiritual experience, the kind that makes life feel meaningful, the kind that connects a human being to love, to beauty, to transcendence, to something beyond the small defended self. That kind of experience requires the exact opposite of everything the narcissist system is built to do. It requires surrender. It requires openness. It requires the willingness to be transformed by something you cannot control, to stand in awe of something that makes you feel small in the most sacred, humbling sense of the word. The narcissist cannot do any of that. Their defenses will not allow it. So what does that mean for how they actually move through life? It means they exist in a kind of inner desert, dry, echoing, spiritually empty in a way that no amount of achievement, admiration, or external validation can fill. They might perform spirituality, they might use spiritual language, attend religious services, position themselves as enlightened or evolved. But underneath the performance, there is no genuine inner experience. There is no felt sense of love as a living force. There is no access to the transcendent. It is all surface, all curated presentation, all echo, and no source. And then you entered their life, you, the empath, and you brought something with you that the narcissist had no framework to understand and no ability to generate themselves. You brought genuine spiritual aliveness, the capacity to feel beauty so deeply it moves you to tears, the ability to love not as a transaction, not as a performance, but as a state of being, an open, unguarded, flowing state of being that connects to something far larger than any single relationship. You could find the sacred in ordinary moments. You could transform pain into meaning. You could hold suffering with grace instead of collapsing under it or weaponizing it. You were, in every spiritual sense of the word, alive in a way the narcissist simply was not. And in your presence, something happened to them that had never happened before. Through you, they could almost touch it. Not directly, their walls would never fully allow that, but close enough to feel the warmth without stepping into the fire. When you experienced wonder, they could witness it and approximate the feeling. When you loved them with that rare, aching quality of unconditional acceptance, they could stand near it and feel something that resembled grace. When you found beauty in a sunset, in a piece of music, in a moment of stillness, they could borrow your experience of it and call it their own. You became, without either of you consciously choosing it, the bridge between the narcissist and the divine. Not in a grand religious sense, in the quiet, daily lived sense. You were their intermediary, their portal, their only access point to the dimensions of human experience that their own psychology had permanently walled off. Think about what that means. Think about what you were actually carrying inside that relationship, on top of everything else you were managing, the walking on eggshells, the confusion, the self-erasure, the constant recalibration of your own reality. On top of all of that, you were functioning as someone's sole connection to spiritual depth, to genuine love, to meaning, to the experience of being, however briefly, more than just a defended, isolated, ego-bound creature moving through a hollow world. That was never a small thing. That was never just a difficult relationship. That was an enormous spiritual weight placed on someone whose only crime was being too loving, too willing to see the best in someone who was not yet capable of meeting them there. And when you left, when you finally, bravely, necessarily left, that portal did not slowly fade. It did not gradually dim. It closed completely, immediately. And the narcissist was returned in an instant to the desert they had always lived in. Except now, for the first time, they knew what they had lost. And that knowledge, that specific and terrible awareness of a warmth you can remember but can no longer reach, is where the real spiritual consequence begins. Most people, when they try to explain what goes wrong after a narcissist loses an empath, reach for psychological language. They talk about narcissistic injury. They talk about ego collapse, about supply withdrawal, about the behavioral spiral that follows abandonment. And those frameworks are useful. They are real, but they only describe the surface of what is actually happening. They describe the symptoms without ever naming the disease. Because what the narcissist is experiencing in the aftermath of losing an empath is not primarily a psychological crisis. At its deepest level, it is a spiritual one. And to understand it, you need to understand something about light, not as a metaphor, not as a poetic flourish, but as a functional, operating reality in the economy of human relationships. The empath carries light. This is not a romantic idealization. It is a description of something that people in the narcissist's life could feel, that strangers in rooms could sense, that children and animals instinctively move toward. It is the particular radiance that comes from a person who has chosen again and again to remain open despite being hurt, to choose love despite having every reason to choose armor, to stay connected to something transcendent even when the immediate circumstances of their life gave them every justification to close down, shut off, and protect themselves at all costs. That quality, that hard-won, costly, luminous openness is not a personality trait. It is a spiritual achievement, and it produces a kind of light that is unmistakable to anyone paying attention. The narcissist was paying attention. In their own way, through their own distorted lens, they knew exactly what they had found in you. Not consciously, perhaps, not in a way they could articulate or would ever admit, but on some level, beneath the manipulation, beneath the control, beneath the cycles of idealization and devaluation, they knew. They had found a source of light unlike anything they had encountered before. And they did what narcissists do with anything they find precious and cannot generate themselves. They position themselves as close to it as possible. They basked in it. They used it. They let it illuminate them from the outside while doing absolutely nothing to cultivate any light of their own from within. And here's what that looked like in practice, inside the relationship you lived. In your presence, the narcissist could access moments of what felt like genuine connection. Your capacity for wonder made ordinary moments feel meaningful. A meal, a walk, a conversation about something beautiful. Your depth of feeling created the impression, for both of you perhaps, of a shared inner life. Your forgiveness and compassion, offered again and again despite being tested again and again, allowed the narcissist to maintain the story that they were fundamentally good, fundamentally lovable, fundamentally capable of the kind of love that they were, in reality, only receiving and never truly returning. Your light was so consistent, so generous, so unconditional, that it cast their shadow entirely out of view behind them. Invisible, easy to deny, as long as you stayed that shadow star, yet hidden. This is one of the most important things to understand about why these relationships persist for as long as they do, and why leaving them is not a simple act of recognizing toxicity and walking away. The empath's presence is not just emotionally sustaining for the narcissist, it is spiritually disguising. It allows the narcissist to avoid the most terrifying encounter of their psychological existence, the encounter with their own inner emptiness, with their own shadow, with the vast echoing void where a genuine self, a spiritual core, a capacity for real love should be. Your light made that void invisible. Your warmth made that cold undetectable. Your fullness made that emptiness impossible to feel. And then you left, and the light went with you. What the narcissist encounters in the immediate aftermath of losing an empath is not what they expect. They expect to feel angry. They expect to feel entitled to your return. They expect on some level to simply find another source and move on relatively intact, because that is what they have always done. What they do not expect, what nothing in their emotional repertoire has prepared them for, is the darkness, the specific, suffocating, disorienting darkness that descends when the only external source of light they have ever had is suddenly completely gone. It is not depression in the clinical sense, though it can look like that from the outside and often gets labeled as such. It is something older and stranger than depression. It is the darkness of a person confronting, for perhaps the first time in their life, what they actually are when no one is reflecting something better back at them. It is the spiritual experience of standing in a room with no mirrors and no windows, and finally being forced to see by the light of your own interior, only to discover that interior has been hollow for a very long time. The contrast is what makes this particular suffering so acute, so unmanageable, so resistant to the narcissist's usual toolkit of denial and deflection. If they had never known your light, they could remain comfortable in their darkness, unconscious of it, unbothered by it. The darkness would simply be the water they swam in, invisible and unremarkable. But they have known your light. They have lived inside it, borrowed it, mistaken it for their own. They have felt what it's like to exist in proximity to someone genuinely spiritually alive, genuinely loving, genuinely connected to something larger than the ego. And now that is gone, and the contrast between the warmth they remember and the cold they are standing in is not just uncomfortable, it is unbearable. This is why the period immediately following your departure is often more destructive for the narcissist than it appears from the outside. This is why the roofing intensifies, why the manipulation escalates, why they reach for you with a desperation that can look dangerously like love. It is not love. It is a person who has had their only light source removed, standing in sudden darkness, reaching for the switch. You are the switch, and you are gone, and no amount of reaching will bring the light back, because the light was never in the switch. It was always in you. There is a concept that gets misused constantly in self-help spaces, flattened into something small and transactional, reduced to a bumper sticker about getting what you deserve. But underneath all the misuse, underneath all the oversimplification, there is something real, something that operates whether you believe in it or not, whether you have a spiritual framework for it or not, whether the narcissist in your life ever acknowledges it or not. It is the principle that energy moves in cycles, that what is sent out eventually returns, that acti, ons, intentions, and patterns of harm do not simply dissolve into the air. They accumulate, they seek resolution, they complete their circuit one way or another in their own time. And in the context of What happens spiritually when a narcissist loses an empath? This principle is not a comfort fantasy. It is not a story we tell ourselves to feel better about the pain we endured. It is a description of something that actually happens visibly, measurably in the life of the narcissist after the empath is gone. But to understand how it happens, you first need to understand what was preventing it from happening while you were still there. The empath, in ways that were never conscious and never chosen, functions as a buffer between the narcissist and the natural consequences of their own behavior. Think about what that means practically inside the relationship you lived. Every time the narcissist lied and you believed them, you absorbed the consequence of that lie. The erosion of trust that should have naturally followed their deception was rerouted through your willingness to extend the benefit of the doubt, to explain it away, to find a version of events that preserved the relationship and protected them from accountability. Every time they raged and you absorbed it without retaliating, you prevented the natural escalation that unchecked aggression tends to produce in relationships where both people have equal footing. Every time they betrayed you and you forgave them, you delayed the abandonment that betrayal would normally ensure. Every time they caused harm in their broader life and you made excuses for them, protected their reputation, smoothed things over with the people they had damaged, you were standing between them and the returning weight of their own actions. You were not doing this maliciously. You were not doing it naively, or at least not entirely. You were doing it because that is what empaths do. You were doing it because your capacity for compassion is genuine and deep and not easily switched off, because you could always see the wounded person underneath the behavior, because leaving felt like abandoning someone who needed you even as they were destroying you. The reasons were real, the love was real, but the function you were serving, spiritually and energetically, was the function of a shock absorber. You were taking the impact of consequences that should have been returning to the narcissist and transforming them into something softer, something survivable, something the narcissist could continue to ignore and continue to repeat. And here is the spiritual reality of what that created over time. Every consequence that was absorbed rather than allowed to complete its cycle became a kind of accumulated debt. Every pattern of harm that went uninterrupted because of your buffering continued and deepened. Every natural corrective that the universe tends toward, the loss of trust, the collapse of relationships, the exposure of deception, was delayed, sometimes by months, sometimes by years, sometimes by the entire length of your relationship. The narcissist was living inside a grace period, an extended, unearned, invisible grace period, funded entirely by your love and your suffering. When you leave, that grace period ends, and what follows is something that people who have watched a narcissist's life unravel after losing an empath describe with a kind of stunned recognition. It happens quickly. It happens across multiple areas of life simultaneously. It looks from the outside like a streak of bad luck, a cascade of misfortune, a sudden and inexplicable collapse of things that had seemed stable. Relationships the narcissist thought were solid begin to crack and fall away. Professional situations that seemed secure begin to unravel. People who had tolerated their behavior for years, buffered from its full impact by the empath's interventions and explanations, suddenly see clearly and begin to withdraw. Secrets surface, lies that were carefully maintained are exposed. The architecture of the false life the narcissist has been constructing begins to show its true instability, and it shows it all at once. The narcissist, predictably, will not interpret any of this correctly. They will call it bad luck. They will call it other people's jealousy, dysfunction, betrayal. They will construct a narrative in which they are the victim of an unfair universe, targeted and mistreated, and surrounded by people who cannot appreciate them. They will reach for that narrative with everything they have, because the alternative, the recognition that they are standing in the returning wave of their own choices, is a confrontation their ego cannot survive without dismantling itself entirely. And dismantling itself is the one thing the narcissist ego will not do without a fight that most of them ultimately lose. But the unraveling continues regardless of the narrative they construct around it. Because this is not punishment. It is important to be precise about that. What is happening is not a cosmic court handing down a sentence. It is simply the restoration of natural balance. It is the completion of cycles that were interrupted. It is the universe doing what it always does when an imbalance is corrected, returning to equilibrium, sometimes gradually, sometimes all at once, always inevitably. The empath's departure removes the force that was maintaining the imbalance, and balance reasserts itself with the momentum of everything that was held back. And underneath all of it, underneath the collapsing relationships and the exposed lies and the unraveling of the carefully curated life, there is something even more significant happening, something quieter and more devastating than any external consequence. The narcissist is losing the story, the internal story they have been telling themselves, sustained for years by your presence, your forgiveness, your willingness to keep choosing them, the story that said they were good, that said they were capable of love. That said, the way they treated you was justified, manageable, not as bad as it seemed, something you had invited, something you would continue to tolerate, because that was simply the nature of what existed between you. That story required you to keep playing your role in it, and you have exited the stage. And without you there to keep the story running, it is collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. And in the rubble of that collapsing story, something the narcissist has been fleeing their entire life is finally unavoidably standing in front of them. Themselves, as they actually are, without the borrowed light, without the buffer, without the grace period, without you. There is a question that sits underneath everything we have been exploring, and it is the question that matters most if you are the empath in this story. Not what happens to the narcissist, not whether they suffer, whether they unravel, whether they are finally forced to confront the darkness they spent years hiding in your light. Those things may be true. They may be happening right now in the life of the person who hurt you. But the question that actually belongs to you, the question that has the power to change the entire trajectory of what comes next in your own life, is this: what does all of this mean for you? What is the spiritual significance, not of their loss, but of your departure? Because your leaving was not just an exit. It was not just an act of self-preservation, though it was certainly that. It was a spiritual event of its own, with its own significance, its own consequences, and its own profound transformation already set in motion the moment you chose yourself over the relationship that was consuming you. To understand what your departure means spiritually, you have to understand where you were before the relationship, what happened to your own spiritual life inside it, and what becomes possible the moment you are no longer pouring your light into a vessel that could never hold it. Before the narcissist, or before you were shaped by whoever first taught you that love required self-erasure, you had access to something extraordinary. You had a direct, unmediated relationship with your own spiritual depth. Your sensitivity was not a wound, it was a gift, a form of perception that allowed you to experience the world at a register most people cannot access. Your capacity for love was not a liability, was a form of spiritual power, the ability to generate genuine connection, genuine warmth, genuine meaning from the inside out, without needing anyone else's reflection to confirm it was real. You were, in the truest sense, a source, not a channel for someone else's borrowed experience of the divine. A source. What the relationship with the narcissist did, gradually and then all at once, was redirect that source. It did not destroy your light. Light cannot be destroyed, but it can be misdirected. It can be channeled so completely toward one consuming, ungrateful, spiritually hollow destination that you begin to forget it was ever yours to begin with. You begin to experience your own sensitivity as a problem rather than a power. You begin to interpret your depth of feeling as instability rather than richness. You begin to shrink the very qualities that made you who you are, because those qualities kept getting used against you, kept being punished, kept being held up as evidence of your irrationality, your neediness, your inability to simply be easier to be with. And slowly, without realizing it was happening, you started living in a kind of spiritual smallness that was never native to you. You started filtering your own perceptions to the narcissist's reality rather than trusting your own. You started giving your energy, your insight, your compassion, your extraordinary capacity for love to someone who was metabolizing all of it and producing nothing in return. You became, in spiritual terms, a river that had been dammed and redirected, still flowing, still powerful, but flowing in the wrong direction toward a destination that could never contain it and away from the landscape that was waiting to be nourished by it. Your leaving changes all of that, not instantly, not without grief, not without the disorientation of suddenly having your energy returned to you after years of it being consumed elsewhere. Healing from a narcissistic relationship is not a clean or linear process, and anyone who tells you otherwise has not truly been through it. There is grief that does not make logical sense, because you are grieving not just the person, but the version of the relationship you believed in, the future you imagined, the love you gave that was never genuinely received. There is a period of spiritual disorientation, a feeling of not knowing who you are without the role you were playing, without the crisis that was always demanding your attention, without the constant low-grade emergency that had become so familiar it had started to feel like home. But underneath the grief, underneath the disorientation, something else is beginning, something quiet and irreversible and profoundly important. Your light is returning to you, not from somewhere outside, not because healing happens to you like weather, but because the dam has been removed, because the misdirection has ended, because the consuming destination is no longer there to pour yourself into. And a river, when the dam is removed, does not need to be told to flow. It simply flows back into its natural course, back toward the places it was always meant to nourish. This is the part of the story that rarely gets told. Everyone talks about what the empath survives. Fewer people talk about what the empath becomes. And what you become on the other side of a relationship that took everything and returned almost nothing is something that should not be possible by ordinary logic. You become more, not less. Not broken permanently, not permanently cautious or closed or diminished. You become more spiritually aware, more discerning, more genuinely powerful in the specific way that only people who have been through a real spiritual trial and come out the other side can be powerful. Because you have done something the narcissist will likely never do. You have sat with your own darkness. You have faced the parts of yourself that allowed the dynamic to persist, the people-pleasing, the self-abandonment, the belief that love required suffering. And you have looked at them honestly, without flinching, without constructing a false self to hide behind. You have done the shadow work that the narcissist fled from, and that work does not leave you where it found you. What is waiting for you on the other side of this is not a return to who you were before. That person, as beautiful and as loving as they were, did not yet have the full depth of wisdom that this experience has forged in you. What is waiting is someone who loves just as deeply, but no longer confuses depth with self-destruction. Someone who remains open, but has learned the difference between openness and exposure. Someone whose light is just as real, just as warm, just as extraordinary, but is no longer available. To be borrowed by people who have no intention of ever finding their own. You are not leaving this experience diminished. You are leaving it refined, clarified, more fully and unapologetically yourself than you have perhaps ever been. And that is the final spiritual truth of what happens when a narcissist loses an empath. The narcissist loses their only connection to the divine. They lose their borrowed light, their karmic buffer, their grace period, their intermediary to everything that makes life spiritually meaningful. They are returned to the desert they built and must now finally decide whether to transform it or remain there forever. But you, the empath, lose nothing that was ever truly yours. You reclaim everything. You reclaim your light, your depth, your power, your future. You reclaim the extraordinary gift of being someone who can love fully and freely in a life and toward people who are actually capable of receiving it. The door that closed behind you did not lock you out of anything worth having. It opened on the other side into everything you were always meant to walk toward.